Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of PORA. I'm your host, David Russell, and I'm actually here with two co-hosts. I didn't expect this. I thought Caleb was going to take the night off, and I was going to have to be doing it again. But
Well, actually,
it's really
I'm
good.
leaving at like
Everybody's here.
6:30, so
Oh,
but I
okay.
stopped by. But I was like, I might as well show up for the first half of it.
Yeah, right on. That's fine. Well, I'm here with both Caleb Jackson and Travis Worth. Guys, how you guys doing?
Hey,
Doing well.
doing pretty good. Yeah, man, really looking forward to this discussion. It's like one of the biggest topics in the philosophy of religion. So I'm super stoked
It
to
is.
be here.
I'm
Right,
also
right.
wondering where the people are for the discussion.
Yes, they're here. They're here. They're waiting to come in.
Oh,
And
okay.
first, because I'm not going to hold anybody up. We got a new face here. His name is Danny from Philtalk. What's up, Danny?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I
Absolutely,
appreciate
yeah.
you coming on, man. I know it was kind of like, hey, this is kind of last minute. Only gave a couple weeks, but I was like, hey, you want to partake in this? And you're like, sure. So I was like, nice. So it's really awesome to have you here, man. Tell us a little bit about what you do and where you're from and stuff like that.
Where I'm from, let's see, I'm in Louisiana. That's where I'm from. But I'm an ex-Christian. I was a Christian for a while. I deconverted about a couple of years ago. But I usually don't say that because I'm not one of these people that like to put in the biography ex-Christian. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Like you'll
Yeah,
go
I hear
to
you. Yeah.
Twitter and they wear it like a badge of honor. I don't have that kind of attitude towards Christianity. I'm very appreciative of what Christianity has done for me. It got me interested in philosophy. I think that I've learned a lot from Christians, and I think that I try to, I guess bridge the gap that the chasm between, at least on YouTube, atheist and theist. But in the sense to have these sorts of dialogues, and I'm sure y'all are part of that project as well. But yeah, I have a degree in philosophy. I'm currently getting my master's degree in philosophy. I teach philosophy on a high school level, and I also teach biology for some reason. That's the desperation of the state of Louisiana. But no, yeah, I deeply enjoy the subject. That was some very intense music, and now I feel like I have to have the answers. But truly,
Yeah.
truly, it's such a difficult question to what is ultimate reality. I'm quite confident that I've got something wrong. But hopefully I'll bring the right things to the table. So thanks for having me again.
Danny, were you just on
and
another?
that's what you do, and that's what you do with Philtalk, right? And how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. I just got on Twitter. And also, yeah, I do have a channel called Philtalk. That's more of a hobby. It's not really a career path for me, but I do have some videos of my debates. I have videos of interviewing certain philosophers. I think the most recent, I talked to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. I'm talking to Dr. Nicholson next week on philosophy of biology. And I have some basic little videos on certain philosophical devices or distinctions, like what's the difference between necessary and contingent, and that's those sorts of stuff too. But that's my channel, Philtalk. It's the red logo. Unfortunately, there's another channel called Philtalk that teaches Filipino. Unless you're going to the Philippines, I would advise that you go for the one with the red logo.
Right.
Danny, weren't you just on Derek Lambert's?
I was,
podcast
Nice.
that I joined right when you were leaving. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
Well,
gonna say, that's
that was purely accidental. I promise.
Oh, I know it wasn't. I just thought it was funny. So yeah, just to give context, go check out Myth Visions. They just had a 30,000 subscriber special, and they opened it up to people. And Danny was on it, and then I joined, and then Danny left. So we're both on it. So go check that out as well. So nice to see him again.
Yeah.
And good to meet you, Danny.
Yeah. Well, guys, next we have Kyle Alander. He is actually been on the show before, but it's been a long time. What's up, Kyle?
Hey, what's up? Nice to be here. So
Yeah,
great to have you, Kyle.
Yeah, again, man, we thank you guys for coming in and discussing this topic. Kyle, why don't you tell us a little bit about your channel and what you do, man, and where you're from?
Yeah, so I live in California, the biggest state in the union. So my time is yeah. And then also my YouTube channel is called Christian Idealism, and my main focus is the philosophy of mind, although philosophy of religion is also important. And obviously, as Danny pointed out, the question of the nature of ultimate reality is definitely important. So that's what I also study. Besides consciousness, I also study the nature of ultimate reality, because that's everything comes from that, right? So your worldview is going to largely depend upon whatever you think the ultimate nature of reality is. So yeah, that's what I do. I currently am working on a I call it the Swinburnian Nuke series, although I had to like change the title a little bit. Although it's still the same name, I just don't put it in the thumbnail and I don't put it in my title. So I just argue for the existence of God using Swinburne's method. So that's what I'm doing right now. But yeah, metaphysics is definitely my big focus.
And I got to say that Kyle and Tim both have really got me a lot more interested in Swinburne, and it's really kind of impacted the way I look at the philosophy of religion myself. So, yeah, great job.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us just a little bit about Christian idealism and where we can find it, and you know, what I know you just described it a little bit, but you know, just go ahead and let us know where we can find you and stuff.
So yeah, just if you look up my name, Kyle Alander, it should pop up. Although you could just probably get in Christian idealism, it'll pop up as well. And yeah, I mean, it's just basically I recently became a Catholic, so I'm debating on whether or not I should change my channel name, but I probably won't, most likely. We'll see.
All right. So the Hail Marys and all that stuff, you're getting into it, man. That's pretty cool. We don't judge here at PRA. Yeah. We'll just call you a heretic. You know, we do that. We did that with David Paulman all the time, you know, and Caleb.
I think that's good. I think that's good. It kind of gets you like more involved, like in your faith. I mean, I see it as a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, the nature of reality, guys. I guess, you know, we just got a discussion on it, but each of you have an opening statement, and each of you have an idea of what ultimate reality is from your worldview. Obviously, we don't have all the answers. We're not saying we do, but I don't have an order of service here because there's no like actual debate. It's not like a normal debate where we have an affirmative and a negative. We have both you guys just giving your worldview. So I will elect, since I introduced Danny first. You want to go first, Danny?
That's fine. I'll go first.
All right. Tell us about the nature of reality, bud.
Well, I sort of, if you look at the world, let's use an analogy as like a forest. Okay. Some people are looking for some kind of basic unit that makes up the forest, some kind of fundamental property, perhaps. And that might be true. But I think at the same time, to identify a fundamental unit is to also miss out on, you know, the different distinctions in the forest. There are trees, there are animals, there's earth, right? And that's sort of my approach to metaphysics, is that while there might be some kind of fundamentality to the world, right? I kind of just start off by categories, and then understand the totality in that way. So, you know, if you take an atomist view, right, the forest is going to be made up of these, you know, fundamental particles or atoms. Maybe not the scientific sense of atom, but more the philosophical sense of atom. And I'm more interested in it seems like there is a distinction between plants and animals and rocks, right? And so I'm very hesitant to say that everything is this or everything is not that. I think that runs into some issues. Let's just take a reason for why, for instance, I'm not a physicalist or naturalist. Okay. If we're going to say everything is natural, okay, I think that actually makes it such that the other side of the dichotomy, the non-natural, doesn't apply to anything. It can't apply to anything. And so when you point something as a natural object, you're really not adding anything substantive, any substantive property to that object. And that argument might be a little bit hard to follow. But I'm going to use maybe an example from moral philosophy. Okay. There's a view called psychological egoism. Okay. Which is the view that everyone acts out of selfish reasons. And that's probably an unsophisticated version of it, but work with me. Okay. If all actions are selfish, right? First of all, then suddenly what does that eliminate? altruistic actions, that doesn't make sense anymore. Okay, that's the first problem, because we have a concept of altruism. Okay, so, and we've applied it before. And when we say that an action is selfish, right, we're not adding anything to the term action, because action has already been defined as selfish. So saying selfish action is redundant, right, because you've eliminated the dichotomy. The same thing is true with naturalism, or, in my view, certain versions of idealism. That if everything is mental, that's unsophisticated, right? Or if everything is physical, there are more sophisticated versions of both views, but I think they kind of still fall prey to the fundamental problem that I'm trying to outline here. And to point out and say that's a natural object rather than a non-natural object, you're really not pointing out anything. And it makes the term vacuous. But yeah, I like to think of metaphysics in terms of categories of things. I'm hesitant to try to find or a unifying totality of reality. But that's my approach, more or less.
All right. Well, that was pretty interesting. Yeah, I hear you. Kyle, man, you're up, bud. You're good to go whenever you'd like.
Okay. So I think the first thing I guess my approach might be a little different than Danny's, although I think we would probably agree on a lot. So my approach is more scientific, although I have to clarify that I'm not advocating for scientism here. What I mean by scientific is just the virtues that science uses, right? So we're talking about predictive success, simplicity, right? And of course, there's different versions of simplicity. But then there's also this question about what is the proper stopping point for explanation? So when I talk about ultimate reality, I'm talking about something that cannot have a further explanation, right? That its nature is that which cannot have any explanation at all, right? So it can't be explained by anything further, right? And I guess some philosophers might try to call this as something that's necessarily existent, something that just exists by necessity, and this something that's necessarily existent just has no further explanation. So that's my approach to ultimate reality. Now, of course, as a theist, I do believe that ultimate reality is God. Now, I have to clarify what that means. So on my view of theism, and of course there's different variations of theism out there. There's classical theism, neoclassical theism. But for me particularly, I care more about God's ultimate nature. So when I talk about God, I'm going to talk about something just with one property of absolute perfection, right? Now, of course, we can hash that what this means later, but basically, in a nutshell, it just basically means something that has all purely positive qualities to it, right? So it's going to have perfect power, perfect knowledge. Again, we can characterize what exactly that means later, but that's what I take the ultimate ground for reality is. And then I also want to also clarify that I think ultimate reality is going to entail certain phenomena. So I believe that pure goodness is going to entail at least one other thing to exist. So if God is all good, then he's going to necessarily create or cause other things to exist, right? And of course, I think it's the Trinity. So I take the view that it's the best kind of action for God to cause two further divine persons, which is the Son and Holy Spirit. And so the Father will cause necessarily these other two persons, divine persons, as we call them. And anything beyond that, so anything that's beyond the Trinity is not going to be necessary. So it's going to be contingent. So it's not going to be guaranteed that God creates those things. Although I will say that there is a high probability that God will create a world. And again, we can get more into that later. But that's my view about ultimate reality. That basically something that is perfect is something that just cannot have any further explanation whatsoever, right? And I can get more into the virtues later, but basically, the virtues for any ultimate metaphysical explanation is it's going to have to be simple. So it's going to have quantitative and qualitative simplicity, but then it's also going to have what's called explanatory simplicity. So it has to have the least amount of fundamental sources of explanation. And then it also has to have what's called explanatory, or the least amount of explanatory questions. So whatever you posit to be the ultimate ground for reality, you have to make sure that whatever that thing is, we can't ask any further questions like, well, why does it have this shape or that shape? Why is its nature this way or that way, right? And so the reason why I put that last part in there is just to help to shave off a lot of views that will try to say, oh, well, what if we just say the universe is necessary? Well, for me, that's not going to work, because if you posit the universe is necessary, then that includes everything that actually exists, and that includes all the natural objects that exist. So for me, I'm just not going to take that view. Now, of course, I'm not saying that naturalists have to take that view, and I don't think you're a naturalist. I mean, you said you weren't, so maybe you take a different view on that. But that's my approach. That basically the best way to assessing what is ultimate reality is going to be those virtues that we use in science. So it's very scientific, although I like to say, instead of it applying to empirical theories, you can use the virtues of those and apply it to metaphysics as well, and make sure that it's in the right metaphysical context. So that's my approach to answering the question of ultimate reality. And I think my view is that something that's absolutely perfect is going to be the type of nature that is going to satisfy those criteria the best way. So that's my take on it.
Very good, very good, guys. We're getting into some deep waters here.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna let the co-host just ask any clarifying questions on this. Caleb, Travis, you guys got any questions before we start?
I understand very well where Kyle's coming from, and I think I have Danny's perspective down pretty good. So I'm just looking forward to an interesting conversation between the two perspectives.
Right on. No questions, Caleb?
I think I was going to ask clarification on Danny's position, because he said he was a naturalist. So I didn't know if does he think that some part of the universe has like a necessary initial state, or does he just reject the idea of necessity and contingency altogether, or what exactly was his view on why the universe exists? I just don't know if I had heard that or if I just misunderstood.
So I'm not a naturalist, and I don't take a strong position on the origin of the universe. Mm-hmm. Apparently there's some decent scientific considerations for thinking the universe had a beginning. Of course, I'm not in a position to push back on that, or even if I were to accept it, I would accept it based on authority. But I don't take there to be any philosophical issues with the universe having a transcendental cause, or the universe also being caused without any explanation, or a universe existing past infinite, right? And so I think all three of those are at least prima facie conceptually coherent. And I guess then the move is in terms of probabilities, right? But I'm not so well versed in a lot of the scientific data to be able to support a view outside from appealing to a scientific consensus.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to our guest again. Danny, I let you start. I'm going to keep it that way. I guess you can start your pushback now, and whatever you want to add in there, whatever you want to start with. It don't matter. We're open. This is an informal discussion. So
yeah. I guess the scientific approach, I mean, I think I know what Kyle means by that. But I think at the same time, a lot of, at least the certain kind of philosophy I'm trained in, analytic philosophy, we study what explanation is, and what could count as an explanation for sure. But there are a lot of things that we ask in analytic philosophy that's nothing to do with explanation. I think that, like, for instance, if you take the position of naturalism or idealism, I don't really think that explains anything. It would be weird to say, why did the ball roll down the hill? And you say, because of naturalism or because of idealism. It seems like we don't want to say that a lot of these metaphysical views are explanatory so much as we're sort of describing the basic ontology of what there is, and that's not strictly explanatory, at least on my view. And I think science is in the business of causal explanation, very much in so, in a specific kind of causal explanation, natural causal explanation. And that would leave room for non-natural causation. And I don't think science is in the business of that, because if there is non-natural causation, I don't take there to be any evidence for it. I think the only way you could be justified in non-natural causation, which I do think there is non-natural causation, is going to be based on a priori arguments or knowing about your own mental causation. So I don't take the mind to be a natural entity. I take it to be wholly distinct and with respect to qualitative, so your experiential states, qualitative states, and your intentional states, your beliefs and desires. I don't think those are natural at all. I think they're pretty powerful arguments against them being natural. But Siri is going crazy on me. But I'll end there.
Okay, yeah. So that was actually really so. I think the first point you made was this idea that idealism and dualism, or physicalism for that matter, are not meant as explanations. I would actually agree with that. So that's where I sort of don't like the Oppian way of like argumentation. So I don't know if you read this book. It's called The Best Argument Against God. And when I read this, I sort of realized that he takes it just from an ontological standpoint, right? So he just says there's natural reality, and then theism postulates supernatural reality. And since naturalism can equally explain it, and since theism can equally explain it, then you just shave off supernatural reality and you keep naturalism. So I agree that is not, at least in terms of like idealism and dualism, those are not explanatory theories. I agree with that, right? Those are ontological positions, right? But what I'm more focused on is what explains the ontology, because you still got to ask that question. Now, of course, you could say that it's just like a brute fact, or maybe it's just necessary, right? But then we have to go back to the criteria I laid out before, and maybe have some reasons to reject the criteria. So maybe we can get into that. So I think it might be helpful to set the ground rules for what, I guess, are we just talking ontology? Because I could probably agree with you that at least when we're just talking strictly ontology, I can agree with you. That's not going to really tell you anything. That's not going to really be explanatory. But for me, I'm more focused on ultimate reality and like, what can ultimate reality explain? That what can we make sense of from that sort of hypothesis, right?
Yeah, let's maybe start with an example. Okay, so I have beliefs and desires. Okay, I take those to be non-natural for a variety of reasons, mainly because I take them to be, and this is going to be a kind of a jargony term, but they're normative on my view. Okay, that means that they act as standards. Okay, for instance, if I ought not steal, that's a standard. And what a standard sort of implies is that there can be success or failure with respect to it, right? So if it's true that I ought not steal, then if I steal, I failed unto the standard. I take my beliefs and desires to be standards, right? If I desire to not steal and I find myself stealing, then I failed with respect to that desire. I think belief functions the same way. Belief is a sort of aim at the truth, and you can miss it. You can fail. And so that's why I don't think that that physical states can be identified with mental states, at least those kinds of mental states, because natural states can't provide standard. So am I giving you an explanation for why I'm a non-naturalist about the mind? Well, there's a loose sense in which I am, but I'm sort of using the meanings of the terms. I'm giving somewhat of a deductive argument, or I'm starting from the fact that, yeah, I when I fail or succeed, I only know that in virtue of having a standard for myself, namely my desire, or my belief, or commitment. And so there's a sense in which I am, but I think that it's all deductive. Then there's a further question as to why is there a mind, right? And a lot of people think that because the mind is non-natural, that natural phenomena are going to be an insufficient explanation for why there are non-natural phenomena. So God is the best explanation for non-natural phenomena like my mind, right? And so that might be an interesting argument. It's one that a lot of
The argument for consciousness, right?
Right. Yeah. So so those are the two things, right? There's like why is it that the mind enters the category of non-natural, and then there's a separate question as to why do I even have a mind in the first place, right? And I just take this to be two different sorts of inquiries, right? I'm more interested in the former, right? The nature of things. I think it's more in line with metaphysics, right? And I think if you want to say that my mind is explained by another mind, a more, let's say the omni mind, God, right? If you're doing metaphysics, I think that might entail some necessity there. Otherwise, if it's a contingent truth, right, then we're not going to be appealing to terms. Like in the way that I established that the mind was non-natural, is I appeal to the very notion of belief and desire as being a standard, right? I think that's what it means to have a belief or desire, is to have a standard for a subject, okay, for how you think the world is or how the world should be, okay? And I think that I'm in line with that. I think that if you want to explain the mind and there's necessity in that same kind of way, like God explains my mind, then I think you're going to have to appeal to terms. Of course, people have done this in the past. Well, they might say that given the term God, right, that entails existence, right? There's the ontological argument for you, right?
Yeah.
But I guess I'll give you the floor, or anyone else the floor.
So there's a few things there. So the first thing would probably be the question regarding, because I mean, every argument for God or against God is about it's about explanation. So typically you'll see that the best explanation is God, right? But then that's talking about an explanation. Yes, there is a distinction between the explanation versus the ontology itself. And I agree with you that at least if you're defining natural as material, then I agree that mind cannot be explained in terms of material, right? I think that just means that there's nothing about material things that predicts or makes likely the existence of minds, right? So that's how I like to think of it. And there might be a case where you might be correct to say that there's like some sort of necessity, like where material objects necessarily do not entail minds, right? And I would probably make the same argument. Now, in the case of God, it's a little different, because in God's case, while I would say that there are certain aspects of God's nature, or at least there's, like, for example, causation, I would say is a necessary aspect of God's nature. So I think that the Father necessarily caused the Son and Holy Spirit, right? But beyond that, because it's not the best kind of action, if God's left with a variety of options, so if there's a variety of best possible actions for God to do, then that's not going to entail necessitarianism, because in that case, God's decisions are all equal in that case, so they're going to be contingent, right? So God's not left with only one option, right? It's not like there's a best possible world that God can create and then he actualizes it. Because I would also agree that if there was a best possible world, then God would create it necessarily, right? But that's not the case here. I'd say that there's a variety of different. Now, of course, I think there's a limit to the variety, right? So I wouldn't say that it's, because some atheists might argue that because God can do anything logically possible, then therefore we can't predict the types of worlds that God would create, because everything consistent with his nature. I just don't accept that, right? I think that God is going to do the best kind of action, right? And then those actions are going to be, so the probability of those actions are all going to be equal. So in that case, that's my second objection, which is basically that I just don't see, given that there's a variety of equal best kind of actions for God to do, then whatever God chooses is still going to be contingent within the range of possible worlds that God could create. So that's my only contention there. But everything else I agree with. So
yeah, you said two things, and I want to applaud you for the first, that you've recognized that that God, certain, at least most of God's choices, like the color of Pluto or the fact that I have a mind, right, can't be necessitated. Otherwise, you're susceptible to the necessitarianism. And no, I mean, there are some brilliant people, very few, that accept necessitarianism, but I don't know how they do it, because it seems like modal logic and the notion of possibility is indispensable to the way that we talk and communicate in our concepts. And also, we use possibility to come to conclusions about how the world is. Take the conceivability argument for dualism, right? That you need to rely on some form of modality for that. Is it, in other words, for those that are, that went over your head in the audience, I just think that, think about, could you exist with no mental life, but just the same brain states, right? If you're going to run something like that argument, you can't be a necessitarian, right? And so, yeah, I'm glad you've recognized that and concluded that it seems like if God creating my mind is some kind of contingent choice, right? It wasn't necessitated. So I'm glad for that. I am in agreement, however, with the atheists that sort of doubt that there can be evidence for God. So usually the dialectic, it goes, okay, I see no evidence for God, or I have evidence for God. I'm in a smaller camp. I don't think it makes sense to say that there can be evidence for God, or honestly, I don't think there can be evidence against God either. Now, I understand you just gave an argument for why you think that can't be true, and we can talk about that in a second, but to kind of just get back, kind of to illustrate why some people like me think that way, and you did depict it very well, is that every state of affair doesn't falsify any kind of state of affair, at least when it comes to certain kinds of empirical states of affairs, like, let's say physical reality. Physical reality is not going to falsify God, right? And if it can't falsify God, it can't confirm God either, right? Now, you appealed to properties like goodness, right? If everything has the property of being good, right, then there's no such thing as the problem of evil, and you've dodged a big objection from atheist land, right? So I think that my position, though, is that physical reality is not going to confirm or disconfirm God. I think that things like for your conception of God, it's moral or value properties that could disconfirm God. So that goodbye ID theory, that's kind of like they want to appeal to physical reality, like the existence of DNA or the flagella. Well, the point is that if there were no DNA and if there was no flagella, it doesn't seem like God's existence is in jeopardy. There wouldn't be like less evidence, at least on my view, right? And I guess another way of describing this, sorry, I'm being long-winded here, but there are certain atheists that might go to various Christians and say, what if we found life on Mars? What would happen to your belief then? I don't know if you've ever been posed that question, but this is a question that might torment a young earth creationist. And I think that one of my young earth creationist friends, quite brilliant, said something like, well, I don't think it would change my belief at all. Seems like I don't have to revise my view at all. But I have a question. If we find no life on Mars, is that evidence for God? So that's very interesting, right? I think that gets to what I'm trying to say here, is that that particular young earth creationist, my friend, right, is showing that, hey, whether there's life on Mars or no life on Mars, it's not going to disconfirm in any sense the existence of God. And for the atheists to think that it might, then I think they would be committed to thinking that if there was no life on Mars, that the God hypothesis is more probable. But obviously then they're not going to accept that.
Okay. Yeah. So, So I think it might be important to discuss the nature of evidence, I guess. So I think you brought up a good point with regards to DNA. I agree that if there were no DNA, that wouldn't therefore show that there's less evidence for God. That's because I think that any particular thing in the universe, like let's just say carbon-based life, or when you talk about like certain things than the periodic table, like those things are equally expected under both hypotheses, under theism and naturalism or any other alternative, because the metaphysical hypotheses are not trying to give you a specific theory or a specific physical theory, that is, or empirical theory that's going to say, oh, well, we would most likely expect this on theism, right? In fact, I would say, like, for example, about a year ago, I was going back and forth with someone on Facebook, and his objection to me was, oh, well, theism doesn't entail or make probable that God would create a universe with an initial low entropy, right? And after thinking about that for a while, I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because it's not like theism does not need to entail that there's going to be this specific thing called entropy that exists, right? It only needs, I would say that theism only needs to make probable that there is going to be a universe. And what I mean by universe in that context is not going to be, it's not going to be a universe that we describe it as, because again, we can make any descriptions we want. What I'm talking about is a public space, a public environment, right? That's what I mean by universe. So I'd say that a public environment would be evidence for God, and I have different lines of reasoning for that. But the specific things in that environment, so like DNA, entropy, like certain specific laws of physics, like those are not evidences for God, because those are just descriptions of what we use to describe the world, right? When you talk about entropy, you're just describing what reality, how reality acts, how that public environment acts. You're not actually saying really anything. And I guess this is probably another reason why I don't want to get too off topic, but this is why I'm an instrumentalist when it comes to science. I think that science is just not in the, I think when we're using science, we're just using descriptions about reality, right? But when we're actually talking about reality itself, science is not going to be able to go beyond the descriptions and beyond the relations between things that exist, right? So that's all I got to say on that. But I think when I say that there's evidence for God, I'm not saying that like I guess just one example would be like consciousness, right? Or like how consciousness is embodied. Like theism does not need to entail that consciousness would embody in humans like that have the same structure as us, right? Like humans could have looked different, right? But the point is that on theism, I think that, and again, we can go more into this later, but I think theism makes it more probable that there's going to be conscious moral agents, and that there will be some sort of geometric structure that gives them that, right? But again, I'm not saying that like specifically my DNA or anybody else's DNA would be evidence for God. So I think we need to be more careful what we mean when we say there's no evidence, because I think what you're saying, and again, I could be wrong here, is that you're saying that there's no evidence for God in the sense of like we can't point to DNA or entropy or like any other physical scientific description of something. Like I agree, like when we're talking about a scientific description of something, I agree with you, that cannot be evidence for God, because you're otherwise you're gonna have to say that theism has to entail a specific physical theory, and I just don't think that's the case. So maybe you could just sort of clarify like what you mean mean by evidence.
So there's the looming issue here. For the background, right? I'll get more into what you were saying, but the background thing, it just seems prima facie suspect to give a probabilistic argument for a necessary being. That kind of already gets my eyebrows up. It's like take the Platonist who's trying to show you that the number 3 exists necessarily, and tries to show you that 3 exists probabilistically. Seems like I would require, if they want to make the claim that numbers exist or forms exist necessarily, right? I need an a priori argument. And a priori arguments to me are not about probability. But at the same time, you make a good point, right? There are 2 senses of evidence that I'm familiar with, right? The entailing sense, and then there's this other sense in which more of an inductive probabilistic sense of evidence. So I'll give an example. Suppose you're wondering whether human beings live on this island that we've never explored before. Okay, what does a human being's existence entail? Not much. I mean, I think it's in that sense, it's strictly unfalsifiable, right? But suppose you see a campfire. Now, I would say that's evidence, right? And notice that there being a human being or a mind, a perspective, a point of view on the island does not entail that there would be a campfire. Okay. And you're wanting to say that, okay, I grant you that, right? That's not a problem for me to grant that God doesn't entail what we're seeing, at least in the natural world, right? But the way that we've come to know the other sense of evidence, where the more probabilistic sense of evidence is based on past experiences with human beings and things like campfires, right? If the reason why that counts as evidence is there's prior experiences with the thing in question, right? And some kind of correlative natural phenomena or natural state, like wood burning on a campfire. Okay. So, and I'm saying that if that's how I construe probabilistically what evidence might look like, or what evidence would look like in the probabilistic sense, right? I don't have any background knowledge about disembodied minds and certain natural phenomena. I only have background information about specific kinds of minds, like animal minds, insect minds, human minds. And so the question is, are we licensed to say that given our correlating phenomena with human minds, we're licensed to make claims about disembodied minds? And I'm not so much on board with that licensure.
I had a clarifying question for Kyle. Like when you look at like something that Swinburne says that, you know, if God exists, it's moderately probable that he would bring about a universe with human bodies and everything. And so when we look at, like, you know, unconscious embodied moral agents, you know, being more explainable under the hypothesis God exists, will God's choice to create moral agency, do we have to kind of posit that as a brute fact?
I would say it depends. So
Okay.
There might be some partial bruteness. So, for example, the amount of things that God creates, right? So, like any specific number, I would say that would be brute, right? But the choice for God to create something like a embodied conscious moral agent, that's not brute, right? Because the embodied conscious moral agent, that's a special kind of act for God to do. So, it's probable that God would do it. Now, I guess that's my response. Now, back to what Danny was saying. So, I would agree that when we're talking about necessary existence, just without specifying its nature, right? Then yes, I would agree that it's not so easy to create probabilistic arguments for that, because especially if we're talking about something that's necessary, right? It's something that exists in all possible worlds, right? So it's equally consistent among each, you know, probable state of affairs, right? And so I think I would be on board with that, and that's why Rasmussen and Proust and Rasmussen, in their book on necessary existence, they do present a lot of deductive arguments, and there's not very much induction going on there. So it's not like probabilistic arguments; they're all like deductive arguments, right? So I think when we're talking about necessary existence without specifying its nature, then yes, I would be on board with you there to say that something just necessary existence by itself, you can't really make a probabilistic argument on that. But I think when it comes to when we specify the nature of something that's necessary, right? So, for example, when we're specifying, let's say there's an initial necessary state, well, I think we can provide probabilistic arguments for why that would be the case rather than, you know, God or something else, right? Now, of course, there are some exceptions. So one example might be mathematics, right? When you say the number 2 and number 3 is necessary, right? How are you going to provide a probabilistic argument for that? Well, I think you can. So one example would be that you take two objects and you put them together and you have the number 2 and you number 3, number 4. So I think given our experiences, we can make inductive arguments for the existence of those necessary truths. But I think that's more epistemic and not metaphysical, because if we're talking about metaphysical necessity, that's going to be more complicated to really argue. But I think when it comes to God, in the case of God, and since I do think that God is necessary, I think that the necessity, so getting rid of God and just talking about necessity, then yeah, I agree. You can't really make a probabilistic argument for that. But I think when you're talking about God, I think you can at least make a probabilistic argument for that. So, and again, that gets into like what theism actually predicts and stuff, which we can get into later.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Yeah. So I think this appealed to the nature of a thing as to sort of as a reply to my argument about probabilistic arguments for things that exist out of necessity. I mean, I'm not so sure how you're using the word nature, but I think that there's a sense in which the 3 has a nature, right? It's a prime number. I think it's a prime number, right? Yeah, it's a prime number, right? There's relational properties about what it proceeds from and what precedes from. I mean, I'm not a mathematician. There are probably numerous properties of 3 that I'm not aware of, right? And I take this to be essential to the number 3. I think that the property being odd and prime is essential to that number. Without it, you wouldn't have. I don't even know what we're talking about. So that's the idea. Is that I would like maybe for you to explain the difference between something that is sort of entailed by definition and or that, there's the nature of 3 and there's the nature of God. Are you distinguishing between those two senses of nature? And then to your second question about probabilistic arguments for Platonism versus, let's say, fictionalism, right? The fictionalist is going to be fine with saying that you have 2 objects in front of you, right? They're not going to contest any of those facts, right? They're just going to say that those are fictions and not real, or not part of some kind of third realm, the Phrygian sense of third realm or the Platonic realm or anything like that. So the language, right? Just saying I have, this is convenient. I have 2 balls here, therefore I can make a probabilistic argument for the number 2 existing. Well, the fictionalist is going to say, well, yeah, you have 2 balls there, right? I just take that to be a mental construction, and we're just talking about these descriptions and kind of projecting our concepts onto physical reality or whatever. So I think that if we're going to solve the problem of Platonism or nominalism, which is to say that no, these things don't really exist like numbers, it's going to be all a priori. And if it's a priori, I do accept the classical affiliation with a priori necessity. And so,
Right.
And that goes back to the original point.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the first thing would be distinguishing between. So I'm not a Platonist, so perhaps I don't have to accept that there are concrete numbers that exist in the world.
You mean abstract numbers? Because they're not going to be
Yes.
concrete.
Oh yeah, abstract. That's okay. Yeah, sorry, I got confused there.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I would probably, although I think you can. So I think here's another thing with regards to what I think about necessities. So I think that necessities, whatever they are, can have certain necessities can have a dependent nature. So for example, mathematics, right? I think a lot of mathematical truths are dependent on other mathematical truths and so on, right? Now, of course, you can ask, okay, well, what about something that's a non-dependent necessity, right? And obviously, I would take the position that God ultimately is what grounds all of them, right? But at the same time, I think that God's property. So this is another take I have. Maybe you can get your thoughts on this.
Mhm.
But I think that God's absolute perfection sort of best explains his necessary existence, or at least it makes it more probable, or entails it, right? So that's my other take on it. That I think that God having the property of absolute perfection, sort of just epistemically, you can epistemically predict that it would also have the property of necessary existence, right? Now, of course, there might be some theists that might, like Swinburne, might disagree with me on that, but yeah.
This notion of dependent nature is not, it's a little opaque to me. I think that there is an example that might make sense of it. Some people think that to have a first order belief means it implies that a second order belief, and those are not the same thing, right? But there's sort of this weird dependency or entailment. And to let me just parse out what that means for others. When I say I believe I'm on YouTube, I believe I'm talking, that on some views implies that I have the belief that I believe that, right? So that's the second order belief. And there is some kind of dependency there, right? It doesn't make sense to say that I have a second order belief about no belief that I have, right? You need to have the second order belief. You must have the first order belief. So there's like a sense in which they depend on one another, but I think that dependency relation is all analytic. It's just true by the terms, right? When I say there's this I that believes, that might be true by definition that there's this self-knowledge, right? And so it's all analytic. I'm not establishing that by appealing to any other kind of metaphysical necessity or physical necessity, or and it's not probabilistic, certainly, at least on my view. So I think that's what you might mean by dependent nature. I'm not too sure.
No, yeah, that would be, so basically think of it as like all the mathematical truths exist in this mathematical landscape. I'm just, you don't even have to be a Platonist to accept this, but like just if you just think of it analytically, right? Just these analytical truths are sort of
okay.
Yeah.
So like 3 depends on 2 or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, it could just go all the way down until you get to like set theory and all that stuff.
There might be a sense in which 3 depends on there being oddness, or that scientific truths depend on numbers, right? The indispensability argument, right? So in that sense, sure. So you wanted to discuss why one might think that God's perfect nature entails existence. Is this essentially saying that, or assuming that existence is a property?
No.
Okay.
No, yeah. I just want to clarify. I agree with Kant that existence is not a predicate. So
okay.
And there's various reasons for that. I don't want to get too much into it. So I mean, we agree on that. But so yeah, I think that it's absolute perfection sort of best explains the necessary existence of a perfect being, right? So that's sort of my take. And of course, there's other things that I think it entails or epistemically predicts, but that's one of the examples. There's a paper called From Necessary Being to Perfect Being, and the author, I forgot his name, but he goes to the same line of reasoning where it's like theism best explains its own necessary nature better than alternatives, right? So it is an abductive argument, and it's applying to
inductive. You said it's an inductive argument.
Yeah, it's an inductive. I think it's abductive. I'm not
okay.
So it's sort of like an abductive argument where it's like there's nothing. So like he brings up the example of like quantum fields, right? If we're gonna say, okay, well, a quantum field is just necessary. Well, then what about the field explained its necessary existence? Like, what property are we appealing to explain why this thing is necessary, other things aren't necessary? And he concludes that there really is no explanation. So if there is, like, if a quantum field is necessary, then it's just brute that is necessary. It's like just this brute contingency. Whereas on theism, you can at least sort of epistemically predict that something that's perfect is just going to have this perfect existence or necessary existence to it.
So I guess the sort of necessity that I understand is of a logical necessity. And I'm wondering if you're kind of playing around with metaphysical necessity. Because
I just want to clarify, it's epistemic, so I don't think it's logically necessary. That's why I think that,
you think it's epistemically necessary?
Well, epistemically predicted, or at least made more likely, or maybe entailed. So I mean, maybe you could say epistemically necessary, but because again, like you pointed out before, it's like we can't make inductive arguments for something that's necessary, right? Especially if we're not really if we're not specifying its nature. If it's just necessary, then I mean, you can't really, you're not going to.
But if you're it seems, but okay, but that's the one thing I wanted to go back to is that you're saying that, I'm right with you, Danny, about the necessary, probabilistic stuff. But when you specify a nature, then I think you can make probabilistic arguments.
Yeah, you can
And-
make probabilistic arguments for why this thing is necessary, not something else is necessary. Right?
Okay,
it's a
so
better
I'm trying to
candidate.
think. I don't think this is what you're talking about, but it might be. I'm gonna guess. Suppose I'm wondering whether there is an all-powerful mind that hates trees. Okay, I don't know. Despises them. Now I'm entertaining that, and I look outside and there are trees all over the place, right? So it seems like that kind of mind doesn't exist. Probably not. But then the tree god worship, the tree hating god worshiper says that there are morally sufficient reasons for allowing these trees for further destruction of future trees, something like that, right?
But that's I get but that's a different argument.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, then I'm misunderstanding you. If you could kind of go over.
No, but yeah. So the argument that I know this is probably like the problem of evil type of objection you bring up, right? And so I guess when it comes to problem of evil, it depends on a few things. So number one, it depends on which theory of normative ethics you're using, right? So if God's a utilitarian, then if God is supposed to minimize the amount of suffering, then he would do it. But then if God's more of a virtue ethicist, it might be a little different, right? So we have to ask that question as well when we're talking about like the problem of evil or something. It's like, what set of background assumptions are we? If we're gonna say God must stop all evil, what does that mean? Like, does it mean he has to be utilitarian and like reduce suffering, or is it the case where God's more interested not in reducing suffering, but rather more interested in creating moral, virtuous agents, right? A version of virtue ethics. So if it's that latter position, then the problem of evil is you're gonna have to make a different sort of argument from evil. You can't just say, okay, here's suffering. God doesn't want suffering, therefore suffering exists, therefore God doesn't exist.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. It does seem kind of funny though. I'm grinning because like God is agreeing with Mill, like it just seems it's just kind of funny to think of it that way. But I guess I don't take utilitarianism. I don't. All of those normative theories are I take to be incoherent. So I don't think any of them work. So I don't imagine God, if he existed, would adopt any of them. I'd imagine God being a particularist of a sort. So that's to say that sometimes consequences matter, sometimes they don't. Sometimes suffering matters, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends on the circumstances. The circumstances dictate what value. And of course, Kant will, just probably turned over in his grave from hearing that, as well as Mill, because they were generalists, right? They wanted to hold on to these principles. I'm like, to heck with principles is a good Christian channel, so I'm be careful with my language. To heck with principles. I reject principles for particularism, and I think particularism poses big issues for those theories that you're talking about. Perhaps not. The closest thing that I think that's compatible with particularism is virtue ethics. But a lot of virtue ethicists are like Rosalind Hursthouse, Julia Annas, Philippina Foot, last name Foot. I can't ever pronounce the first name. They don't identify as particularist. I think that Peter Geach was a kind of virtue ethicist, and now he appealed to something like ideal observer theory. But like, yeah, I don't. But the general point here is that you're saying that I have to have some kind of normative ethic in order to run a problem of evil. I don't think that's true, because I think that all you need for
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that only specific. So if you present like an argument to me, right, and if the premises in that argument contain certain assumptions about the nature of what morality is, then I think in that case you're going to have to assume a particular. It just depends on the argument, because I do agree that you can present.
So are you saying this, that it's just not fair to the theist? And I'll agree with you here. This is what you're saying, that, hey, I see suffering, therefore God doesn't exist, right? Like,
like
for example,
is that, So like one example would be like Mackey's argument from evil. It's like, well, if one of the premises is like, oh, well, God has to minimize suffering or minimize that, it's like, well, I'm just not going to accept that.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
No, I agree with you. I think that then I didn't know Mackie forwarded something like that, but I would agree with you, and we'd team up against Mackie. But I think that the strongest version of the problem of evil is saying, hey, Christianity thinks there's evil. So it's all internal. I think to do some kind of external critique about evil is just so weak.
Yeah.
Because the theist could just say, I don't see why I would accept your moral intuitions about these things or these moral views, right? But I think that the fact is that theism, or at least certain kinds of theism, are saying that you have this omni-God and yet they're still evil. And we don't need to get into what Christianity thinks is evil. The fact that they think there's evil is the problem.
Or the Calvinist.
But I don't know if our host wants to direct us in one way or another.
No, but I was gonna, we've already been going about an hour, and I was going to see if you guys could take some questions from the audience.
Oh, sure. I mean,
we've got two. We've got the first one for Kyle. I'll put it up on the screen. It says, for Kyle, why not take a Mysterian position on the hard problem and say that it is the product of our epistemic limitations rather than making ontological claims about consciousness?
Okay, so I guess the issue with that is if you're going to do that, that's a theoretical cost, right? Yeah. That means your theory, whatever it is, so in this case, reductionism, is just going to lack the explanatory power to account for consciousness. And if those alternative views that have more explanatory power, then I'm going to accept those views. Unless the reductionist can give me some other reason why I should accept reductionism. So let's say, I'm presented with a hard problem, right? And I take a Mysterian position because I have this other reason to accept reductionism. But in the case of reductionism, I'm not given any other reason to accept it. Like, there's nothing in neuroscience, to my mind at least, that supports it, right? I mean, I've seen all the correlation arguments. I mean, I just don't think they work. And there's other alternatives out there that is equally consistent with neuroscience and what it says, and it equally, I think, better explains consciousness than reductionism does. So if I'm going to be a Mysterian, right, if I'm going to hold to some sort of Mysterian position, there has to be some other reason why I accept it. So, for example, there might be some aspect to the problem of evil that I'm a Mysterian about, right? So there might be, like, let's say, some like teleological version of the problem of evil that I'm just going to be like, well, I don't really know why God allows this particular evil, right? But the reason why I do that is because I have other reasons to accept theism, right? But then in the case of reductionism, there's just no, like, symmetry there. It's like, if I'm going to be a Mysterian, there has to be some other reason for why I'm a reductionist still, despite that problem. So,
do you mind if I try to address?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm mostly in agreement with Kyle. I just think that, well, on my view, there's going to be a point. This is to Kyle's kind of view of metaphysics, that there is no explanation, right? Now, for the theist, there might be a further explanation as to why I'm having the experiences I'm having, given the correlative natural phenomenon that's God, sure. But let's say you're not a theist, then there just not be an explanation there, right? It's the fact that there is some kind of dependency or even a causal relation, and it's not explicable in terms of some further natural law or natural mechanism. And that's not a Mysterian response. A Mysterian response is, oh, we just don't know, right? Like, who knows? We can't know, whatever, right? To say that, hey, no, A causes B, there's not some further explanation for that causal link, that's not a Mysterian view.
Right on. Well, this question's for Danny. How does the ingrained nature of possibility in our language, which is conceptual, show that necessitarianism, which is ontological, is false or extremely unlikely?
You see, I don't think, now I could be wrong, but I don't think that necessitarianism is commits you to any particular ontology, except that maybe there are no there's abstract objects, but they're not going to be abstract objects about possible worlds. So, but it's not making strong ontological claims. You could be an atheist, you could be a theist, a naturalist, whatever. You can and be a necessitarian, right? There are atheists that are necessitarians, or there are all sorts of people that are necessitarians. So I think the idea is that the way, however that ontology is the only way that it could have been, and rather I should say the extension of those ontologies. So what I mean is that there are non-natural things, and part of that set is my mind, Kyle's mind, Travis's mind, David's mind, right? And so what they're saying is that the extension of each of these set of mind is fixed, couldn't be otherwise. Okay. But notice that, you could just have a different ontology, right? And still think that necessitarianism is true, which is why I don't take it to be a ontological view per se. Can you put the question back up? That was just kind of like a few, sorry, it's so long-winded, but yeah, I think that there are certain things that I think possibility is indispensable to. I think, for instance, like stuff like blame and free will, and I'm sorry, I'm not letting go of the fact that there's free will. There might be good arguments for why we have free will. But even if I if I weren't aware of those arguments, I'm sorry, I'm not letting that go. I'd rather you call me irrational before I let that go, and I don't think I'm far from it. But at least with respect to free will. But I think that something like necessitarianism is a big problem for if you're positing free will.
All right. Well, Kyle, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah. So I guess necessitarianism, I think Danny still made this point where it's like necessitarianism is a modality view, right? So it's just claiming that all possible worlds is just one actual world. So wherever that world is just going to be necessary, right? And you can accept that on any ontological view. So I think the point is that the fact that we can talk about different possibilities in our language, that just shows that we could talk about different possible worlds in our language, and that these possible worlds are all going to be, a lot of them are going to be contingent, right? So that's going to falsify necessitarianism. So that's all I got to say on that.
Right. All right. This one's for Kyle. Why think that maximizing theoretical virtues and minimizing ontological costs reflects a true picture of reality? Why can't reality be non-parsimonious?
So there's a few points on this. The last point, maybe, well, we'll see how it goes. But the first reason why I think is because we do that all the time in science, right? We're trying to build the best theories of the world. We want to make sure that we maximize theoretical virtues and minimize, the ontological costs there. And of course, there's a lot of different virtues. So there's like different forms of simplicity. There's different forms of explanatory power, right? But it's all, generally speaking, those are like the two most important virtues. And I guess the second point is more practical. So in science, the virtues that we use in science are actually, I would say, like when we talk about predictability, simplicity, all that stuff, we literally are doing that every day of our lives. Like our own cognitive processes rely on that 24/7, right? If I'm driving my car and if I can't predict, what's going to be down the road, I might actually hit somebody or something, right? And if my theory or if my cognitive processes are not simple, then when I'm thinking about something or trying to like model the world, right, there's going to be a lot of unnecessary things. So I have to make sure that whatever my model is of the world is simple, right? So there's also that perspective as well, where it's like these are practical considerations, right? We want to make sure that when we're modeling our view of the world, that we can make sure that our model predicts things so that to keep us safe, and that it's simple, and that it has optimal flexibility, and that it's coherent as well, right? Sure. So that's sort of my reasons why. So yeah, that's my whole view.
All right, Danny, you want to weigh in?
Very, very briefly. I think for me, whether parsimony is virtuous or not is whether you have a reason or to postulate an entity. It seems like parsimony not being when parsimony is not when someone's just positing extra entities for no reason, then I think that's when you have Occam's razor. But let's say Kyle has a reason for postulating a transcendental cause to the universe. I just don't see why we're talking about Occam's razor or parsimony anymore, right? It's if Kyle just said, "Oh well, that sounds great. Let's just put a transcendental cause there just for icing on the cake." Then I think that's when something like Occam's razor becomes applicable. But I don't think that's what's going on. Even if I disagree with his reasoning, the fact is that I have to address his reason, not just come out with, oh, parsimony, Occam's razor, But that's how I understand parsimony.
All right, so I'm going to ask this one in conjunction with another one I got. Both of you guys have basically said that you think mind is not natural. Right. So one of the questions I got was, why wouldn't it be natural? For one, this person gave me a list of how the brain functions with the moving of the hand and all that stuff. Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't love be just a chemical? And of course, for Danny, it says, how could one demonstrate to you that consciousness is physical if it is? So just kind of take those two for both of you and explain maybe why it would be non-natural.
I guess I can go. I mean, you want to go, Kyle? Or
No, you can go first,
okay.
And I'll explain.
Yeah. So to me, it's almost like asking, could someone demonstrate to you that 3 is even? I'm just like, it just seems inconceivable given that my arguments are a priori and kind of established necessity. But I will give you one thing that could change my mind. And it's this. It's that I might have a myopic notion of the physical. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say I define the physical as that which is made of diamonds. Well, guess what? That makes mind non-physical, because mind is not made of diamonds, right? The neuroscientists are going to be dualist, right, on that, because they don't think the brain is made of diamonds, and so the brain, they're committed to non-physical. So the idea is that I might have a myopic understanding of physical, okay, but technically, right, if I'm using that myopic definition of physical, my argument's going to go through, right? Just like if that person said physical is that which is diamond, well, everyone's going to agree with them. Everyone's going to be a dualist at that point, right? They're not going to object to the reasoning there. They're going to object, hey, that's not what I mean by physical. And I think that's pretty much the only way at this point for me to kind of let go of that particular metaphysical view.
All right. Kyle?
Okay, yeah. So I'd probably say something similar to Danny. So how could one demonstrate that consciousness is physical? Well, it just depends on what you mean. It depends on what you mean on consciousness, and it depends on what you mean by physical, right? If you're a panpsychist, like I would happily admit that I'm a panpsychist. It depends, if you're going to say, okay, well, all physical objects are just the nature of that physical object is consciousness. What does that even mean? In that case, well, then yeah, consciousness would be physical. But of course, panpsychism is not a reductionistic view, right? So if we're talking about reductionism, so if we're talking like identity theory or whatever, then you're just going to have to cash out what you mean by consciousness and what you mean by physical, right? So if you're going to define these two terms in ways that preclude each other, then the hard problem of consciousness is just always going to be a problem for that sort of view. But then if you redefine consciousness or maybe redefine physical in different terms, right, then maybe it is the case that consciousness is physical. So it just depends on what you mean by the terms. And if the terms preclude each other, then that view is just not going to work. You're always going to have a problem of consciousness. But then if you change the views a little bit, then it will work. So as an example, I'm an idealist and I'm also panpsychist. So what does that mean? Well, it means that whatever I describe as physical is just going to be experience, right? Like the world is just experience and that's it. on my view, there would be no physical in the way that physicalists understand it, because my understanding of physical is different, right? So it just depends on what you mean by those two. So
Yeah, so it sounds like it's really important to define your terms in that.
Right. Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, we're in the last section here, and I just want to give both of you 2 to 3 minutes to give your closing thoughts on the discussion and to plug your channels again. Definitely plug your stuff so we can get, people listening and so forth, and so we can end up having more of these type of conversations. So, Danny, in the tradition of going first, you're up, bro.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on. It's to even if we had 4 hours, right? This is a difficult subject. And I look forward to future conversations. I mean, I think that it's good that Kyle and people like Kyle and are sort of not giving the science describes the world in a wholehearted way. You said in the very beginning, you're not a scientist or you don't subscribe to scientism, right? And I think that when you look at the way that professional philosophers discuss these issues, it somewhat looks like what we're doing here, right? Where the professional philosopher, or at least even the layman can do this, but I think the job of the philosopher is to be sort of a concept doctor, right? There is room for debate. There's room for drama and shenanigans, on YouTube and stuff like that. But really, we're trying to evaluate our concepts and our views in a way where we could help each other and build off each other. And even, hey, look, there's something wrong here. You might need to revise. And I think that this conversation sort of models that approach. And so I'm very appreciative of that. But no, yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, I think that this discussion was very, very good. I guess a few final thoughts. So the first thing I want to I appreciate Danny for being, respectful and of my view, and we went back and forth in a few things. Another thing is that I view metaphysics as just the science of ultimate reality. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that when we're talking about ultimate reality, I think we should apply the virtue of science. Although I think we should, when we're talking about like predictions or simplicity or whatever, you should characterize those in metaphysical terms rather than scientific ones. Because when we're talking about science, right, we're just talking like empirical theories. And obviously, I don't think that metaphysics is strictly an empirical phenomena, right? So I think that me and Danny would be scientists of the nature of ultimate reality in that case. And that's what scientists do, right? They disagree, they talk about their disagreements and try to sort those out. So I thought it was actually, this is a good example of that taking place. One final thing is that I was going to mention this in the beginning, but I forgot to. I am actually getting a degree in philosophy. So me and Danny are actually like in the same field of study, which is philosophy.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
It's just I haven't gotten my bachelor's. I still have a few more years before I get there, and I know Danny, you're going for your master's, so that's good. But yeah, that was the last thing I want to say. That we're both on the journey together to find truth, right? So I appreciate it. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, I'm getting a degree in philosophy too, guys. So we're all, but
atmospheric science.
But I did want to bank off that and applaud both of you for you use big words, for the audience, but the way you guys explain things were really, really understandable and easy for people to pick up on. And I could just tell you guys barely scratched the surface of all this too. So, and that's just the nature of these discussions. So yeah, I will invite both of you back on to discuss this even further, and dive into different, I guess what they call the umbrella topics of this entire genre, So, I mean, if you guys are open to it, this is the type of show that does this type of stuff. So we love it and we love doing it. So again, I appreciate you guys coming on. Travis, you got any? Well, Travis, you're up next. You're going to be debating the fine tuning argument next week.
I did that yesterday.
Contingency. That was contingency. Yeah, you did that yesterday. It's contingency you're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I'm sort of an explanation. I like making an inference to the best explanation of why this and that. So yeah, looking forward to that. And again, I want to thank Kyle and Danny for coming on. I thought this is a really interesting topic. It's something that I myself am very interested in, and you know, I really like a lot of what Kyle said with bringing in the theoretical virtues and everything, but not in a in a science appealing to scientism and things of that nature. And I really like hearing Danny's perspective with, which I think is very interesting. So I'm just super glad we had this conversation.
Right. Well, again, we will be back next week, guys. Again, thanks to our guests for coming. We thank our audience for being here. Again, this is PORA, and we are out of here. Have a good day.